Everybody good? All right, so if you remember last class, we were looking at the oddness argument or the queerness argument. It's an argument for moral skepticism or ethical subjectivism, and the reading for today went through a few arguments for ethical subjectivism. What I'm going to mainly focus on out of today's reading is an objection to the oddness argument, and then leave it up to y'all to analyze the argument based on that information. So if you remember last time, here's the oddness, a basic version of the oddness argument for moral skepticism, against objectivity and universality, for ethical subjectivism, however you want to say that. So the name of the argument tells you what the main idea is, right? Oddness. So what's the odd part, right? And how is the argument saying that does count for or against either moral realism or moral anti-realism? Again, that's our big debate in this section of the class. So first premise here: if there are any genuine moral requirements, remember Mackey specified what he means by a moral requirement. It was that unconditional imperative that we talked about last time. Made that distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. It's the categorical kind he's arguing against. Right? So if there are any genuine moral requirements like categorical imperatives or objective moral truths, right, moral facts, that kind of thing, then they, A, must be like the other things we know to exist, and we would also have mental access to that knowledge in our usual ways of knowing, and B, be intrinsically motivated or reason-giving. In other words, they gotta take care of that motivation problem. And the idea that they're intrinsically motivating is that they have within themselves the motivation for us to adhere to them, either because we gave them to ourselves or there's some kind of external requirement upon us. So the first premise is that. And the second premise is moral judgments or requirements, if they existed, here's the oddness part, right, would have to be unlike anything else we know and are not intrinsically motivating or reason-giving. And so what he's getting at here is kind of an embedded assumption here. It's not a problem that he has an assumption built in. All arguments have assumptions built into them. The issue is always whether they're reasonable assumptions or not. And so what he's driving at here is basically he's a naturalist. What he means by the other things we know, in the essay, if you recall, he talked about it being part of the fabric of the world. Well, how is it that we know what is in the world and isn't in the world usually? What's one of the main ways in which we can determine that? Through what? It's a method. I'm sorry?
Our senses?
Yeah, your senses, or the scientific method, with it's just a formalization of those, right? So it's sense experience. So he's basically claiming that the things that exist are natural phenomena in some way or another. They're not non-natural properties. In other words, they're physical things that empirical sciences could find out about through observation and measurement, right? Therefore, there are no, so in other words, if they did exist, they would have to be unlike all this other stuff we know to exist. It would have to be through some special faculty other than our usual ways of knowing, and they would have to be intrinsically motivating or reason-giving. And so then we get to the conclusion, therefore, there are no genuine, objectively true moral requirements, right? So that's the basic idea of the oddness argument that we went through last time. Anybody have questions about what Mackey's arguing? So again, it's an argument for moral skepticism, and as he says it in his restricted sense, ethical subjectivism as well. Anybody have questions on the oddness argument held over from last time? Everybody's good on that? All right, so we mentioned, last time, I kind of already started this, that we're in questioning the oddness argument. We can worry about, a couple of parts of that argument. Wolf, from this other book that I sometimes use, says this argument's based on Mackey's reflections about the strangeness of objective values. They would have to be like these Platonic forms, like these abstract ideas that are somehow in the fabric of the universe or something like that. So like numbers, almost, abstract ideas, right? So how odd they seem to be and how odd it is that we could come to know anything about them or be motivated to follow them. There's that prescriptivity part. Of course, not everyone shares Mackey's puzzlement. And one of the arguments that Schaefer-Landau goes through that you read about for today has a response to this. And so I'm just pulling out the key passage about the oddness argument just out of that article there. So here's that passage. And he doesn't take a hard stand on either one of them, but you can still see his point. In other essays, he does take a hard stand on it, and it's ethical non-naturalism. So the first view here, ethical naturalism, that just means that there are objective moral truths, and contrary to appearances, we could find out them through our senses or through the scientific method. It's a fairly controversial position, even within philosophy, but there are people who hold it. If you know who like Sam Harris is, he's some kind of ethical naturalist, and the problem they confront is the is-ought problem. Right, so that's one option. The first strategy, he says, is ethical naturalism claims that despite appearances, moral facts or objective moral truths, however you want to say that, really are natural scientific facts about the world, just like the fact of how many people are in the room right now. Right? So they could be, so whether something is right or wrong can be verified in just the same way that a scientific hypothesis can be. Prominent examples of ethical naturalism include the claims that actions are morally right if and only if they maximize pleasure. That's like utilitarianism is the name of that view. It's overall pleasure, not just one's own. So that's a utilitarian view. That's a theory we'll come to later in this semester. That things are good just because they are desired. That's called satisfaction or desire satisfaction theory. And so if you get what you desire, then that's a good thing. Right, the fulfillment of the desire, right? And that exchanges are just if and only if all parties to the transfer have agreed to abide by its terms. That's like a form of contract morality. Again, that we'll cover that pretty early in the next section of the class, right? So that's the first option that he gives. The other strategy that he mentions in there is ethical non-naturalism. So it agrees with ethical naturalism that there are moral truths, objective moral truths, but it says they are not natural facts about the world. They're more like mathematics, like pure mathematics, or truths of reason, this sort of thing, or logical truths, that there are moral truths like that as well, right? And so he said, that's the little ellipses where I take that part out. He says, what is important for our purposes is that if these claims or others like them are true, then all it takes is ordinary empirical investigation to determine whether or not actions are right, good, or just. There doesn't seem to be anything especially weird or mysterious about pleasure, desire, or agreements. In fact, we make agreements all the time, right? It's probably the least controversial one of them, maybe. So there doesn't seem to be anything especially weird or odd or mysterious about pleasure, desire, or agreements. If moral facts consist of just these sorts of humdrum things, then moral facts are not at all strange, right? So again, that's right out of the reading for today. He covers several different arguments. One of them is an economy argument where he's worried about like, well, which one best explains the data, moral realism or moral anti-realism? And the argument from economy says that we can make sense of everything, all the facts that we have to make sense of without positing moral truths. All you have to do is posit moral beliefs that motivate people, whether they're true or false. So that's another way that he goes. And then this is his objection to the oddness argument. So let me pause here and ask, are there any questions about either the oddness argument or the criticism that Schaefer-Landau mentions in this passage? Any questions about either of those things? Everybody's good on those? Right? All right, put everything away except for something to write with. Let's do a little quiz. One question. And it's set up very much like the more difficult questions on the exam is set up. And give you an idea. get the copy, and then I want to go over an instruction or two with you here. Here you go. Make sure you put your name on there. Philosophy 2020, today's the 11th. So what I'm doing here is really a couple of things. One, I want to make sure you have some of the basic vocabulary about arguments down that we covered that second week, right? And then the second thing is being able to pick out, the problematic premise in an argument based on a given criticism. So that's the we got a back and forth here, right? So up top we have the oddness argument. If objective moral values exist, then they must be like other things we know to exist and be intrinsically motivating. But objective moral values would have to be completely unlike anything we know to exist in the natural world and are not intrinsically motivating. Thus, objective moral values do not exist. There's our subjectivist and moral skeptic conclusion, right? And then we get the objections, the same one that's up here. And then here's the question down at the bottom. Suppose for the sake of argument that ethical naturalism is true. So for the sake of argument, you're entertaining Schaefer-Landau's position, or the one that it's actually not his position, the one he's discussing. He's actually an ethical non-naturalist, right? If ethical naturalism is true, right, or the objection is correct, which premise or premises in the oddness argument is incorrect? It's got a little multiple choice down here, right? Just like we would have on the exam. You can just circle your answer. Make sure you put your name on it, though. I'm going to give you a minute to read through it, think about it, and then do your answer. Done if you just flip yours upside down so I can get an idea from looking around the room how many people have done. I'm going to ask you to do something kind of quickly with these. Getting back to them today. I'm wrapping up. And it's just make a list. Who got it right or not, so we can return their actual sheet to them. And then you can enter the grade. Yeah. But they would get this back so they could use it on the exam. Yeah. How many folks are still working just by show of hands? Okay. It helps. Don't think about it as a logical problem question. Just think about it as a reading comprehension question. Right? What part of the argument does that criticism most directly attack? It's either going to be, it's going to be one or more of those lines in that argument. Yeah.
On the exam, is there going to be a text for us?
Yeah, they'll look like this. Yeah. It'll either have that, there may be a few in there that have references to the readings, but there's an indicator on there somewhere. Yeah. I usually try to give the passage there so you don't have to spend time. Folks are still working? Do you need a sheet of paper to write stuff down?
No, I got it.
You got it? Okay. Or do you have your computer with you?
Yeah, I do.
I don't know if you'll have time to just enter them as you go, but you might.
I think it might just be simpler to just
Yeah, and then do it later, so you're not rushed. Yeah. Anybody still working now? Everybody's done? Good? Were y'all all good? I think there were a few of y'all that were still working. Everybody's good over here? All right, just pass them on. Make sure your name's on there. Pass them over to Brian. Reverse it. Does Brian have Brian have everybody's? All right. Which line can we exclude off the bat? 3, because it's a conclusion, not a premise. So if you know the basic vocabulary for arguments that we covered, you should be able to start to rule some stuff out. If you don't understand the vocabulary over arguments that we covered all that second week, you're going to have trouble understanding what that question's asking for you. So if you make sure you understand those parts, right? So we know it's not 3. So that leaves 1, 2, or 1 and 2. And let's just do how many people say it's 1? Raise your hands just up high so I can see them. Is it just 1? How many people say it's 2? Only 2, so that's the majority. How many people think it's both 1 and 2? It's premise 2. What does the criticism say? That they're not what? They're not so weird. Which premise says they're weird? 2. Everybody see it? So what you're doing there is you're making sure, are they attacking a direct part of the premise? Excuse me, are they attacking a whole premise? Or are they saying that this doesn't follow from that? If they're saying this doesn't follow from that, then they're going after a conditional premise. But if they're just asserting one part of that argument against one part of that argument, and that one part only appears in one line, then it's going to be that part, Savannah.
Quick question. Why isn't it 1? Because the intrinsically motivated is essentially 2. Is it not?
Well, the 2 is the part that he's saying is false.
Right.
Right? He doesn't, so just like I just said, he's not saying this doesn't follow from that. He's just saying they're not that. They're not weird, right? So the whole point of that passage is, hey, the argument says that they're weird, but here's some examples of how they wouldn't have to be weird at all. So he's going after the one that's just asserting that they are weird. He's not going after the conditional. So if somebody in the argument's saying, well, there are 2 options, but here's a third, then we know they're going after a disjunctive sentence, right? If they're saying this doesn't follow from that, like if then, that whole thing is false, then they're going after a conditional. If they're just asserting a counterclaim, then you're looking for that one assertion, and that's going to be the one that's most directly challenged. Make some sense? Right, so there'll be several, the harder questions on the exam will look like that. There'll be argument analysis questions or like some fallacy questions as well. So we can go back over that stuff here in a minute. Right, questions about analyzing the oddness argument. So I think we did one worksheet on relativism as well, same kind of deal, right? We'll be doing a bunch of from here on out, after we start the normative stuff, it's going to be applying the standards to different scenarios. So we'll have fewer arguments going on here, except for like criticisms of theories. Most of it will be applying the theory and then looking at some problems with it. All right, so there's the oddness argument. So if Schaefer-Landau is correct there, go back to the PC. So if he's correct that even if only one of those options were true, he would have a good reason against the oddness argument, right? Because it only takes one. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Right, so then here's another kind of argument. Again, I hope this one is fairly familiar to you. We encountered the cultural differences argument with moral relativism, right? It was look at all the moral relativism, look at all the different societies have different codes, right? Therefore, there's no universal and they must be based on cultural consensus, right? Here's another kind of argument, one that has that disagreement element to it. But this time it's going to be an argument against moral objectivity. So here's how the argument goes. I just put it in a conversational form for this one. I don't really think that there are any objective or universal ethical, that is to say prescriptive truths. Claims like lying is wrong or you should not lie are not objectively true at all. If ethical objectivism is true, we wouldn't find so much persistent, intractable disagreement over morality. So when you're reading these things, if that doesn't jump out to you, that if, then, right, if that's not jumping out to you as important, like you're not reading carefully enough, you got to be thinking about those argument forms, right? It's already an if-then setup, right? So it's kind of tipping you off there. So, but when we look at morality, we find widely divergent moral beliefs that are the focus of much debate. Even people who otherwise agree that there are objective ethical truths disagree over which prescriptive claims are objectively true. Some ethical objectivists think that it's always wrong to kill an innocent person, while others have developed intricate and subtle arguments that support the view that it's sometimes permissible to kill an innocent person so long as it maximizes overall happiness. Again, that's the utilitarian view. Some ethical objectivists think that it's objectively true that lying is others think that it's sometimes permissible to lie. Moral theorists have been arguing over these fundamental issues for centuries, but the same disagreements persist, and no more persuasive arguments or evidence to resolve those debates appears to be forthcoming. It's not even clear what conceivable evidence would resolve those disagreements. So if you remember the relativity argument from last time from Mackey, that first one that we looked at before the oddness argument, he appealed to that same kind of notion that disagreement in science is different than disagreement in morality, because in science, we at least can conceive of what kind of physical evidence or mathematical problem would resolve it, even if we haven't found it yet. So he says it's not even clear what conceivable evidence would resolve these moral disagreements. So there's no good reason to think that there are objectively true moral judgments. In other words, ethical objectivism is false. I know this view isn't popular among moral theorists, but it's what I believe. I think all those moral theorists are mistaken. Just in your notes, see if you can identify the argument there, and I'll give you a few argument forms to think about. Since I didn't really emphasize you learning these much, I'll put them up here. So one of them is, let's just do modus tollens. So that means you'd be looking for an if P, then Q, and then what's it an argument for? What position does this support? Moral skepticism or subjectivism or moral realism? I'm sorry? I heard a bunch of mumbling, I'm sorry. Somebody tell me.
Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, which position does this support? Ethical realism or ethical anti-realism? Anti-realism, right? It's another argument for skepticism. It's denying that big debate, right, where we had all the different versions of these going through. So look for a path. Look for the sentences in there that already match this form. And then we know the conclusion line is line 3, and it's going to involve thus there are no objective moral truths. Really what you're looking is for the sentences that make that form up and cutting everything else out of there, and you'd have it. This is the way I happen to have written it. Yeah.
You have a different form.
You could use modus ponens. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. But the way I have it set up in this passage already matches modus tollens. If it didn't already match it, you'd have to think about how you could like restate it in one of those forms, right? How many folks have something already? Question? Or just responding? Yeah.
Yeah, my bad. Another kind of question you can expect to see on exams is where there's a passage like this and the question's asking you, what position does it support or reject? Could be questions like that on there. How many folks have something now? Give you another minute or so.
Who wrote this argument?
That's a spec argument that I did. But you can find, like, there's one in Mackey that's similar to that. That relativity argument that we went over is like that. This is a pretty common argument to see for moral anti-realism. Disagreement arguments pop up in a lot of areas in philosophy. Aesthetics, problem of religious pluralism, right? Stuff like that. All right, go ahead and go here. So let's make this bigger. So, well, dang it. So that's basically the first two premises you just need to restate, right? So if ethical objectivism is true, then we wouldn't find so much persistent and intractable disagreement over morality. But when we look around, that is what we find. So there's our not Q, right? And then the conclusion, if ethical objectivism is true, conclusion, in other words, ethical objectivism is false, right? So there's the argument. Everybody get that, right? Or something close to it. The rest of it's explanation of those premises, right? So you're just cutting that out and leaving it. So you should have something that looks like, if we're using modus ponens, or excuse me, modus tollens anyway. So that's a modus tollens version of it. Just like that. Right. And then notice the difference between this argument and the one earlier. Before, like when we covered moral relativism, it was disagreement between cultures, lay people in cultures. Here, this one is appealing to disagreement among moral theorists, right? So that's different than just disagreement among lay people. Subtle difference there. So it's not just the fact of disagreement, it's that there's disagreement that's persistent and intractable. We can't even figure out what kind of evidence would do it, right? So there's the intractable part of it. Make some sense, right? And then let's take a look at an objection here. So the argument from persistent intractable disagreement relies on the following assumption. Notice the first premise. If there's persistent intractable disagreement, we wouldn't find such, if ethical objectivism is true, we wouldn't find so much intractable disagreement. So that's the assumption underlying the first premise. Let's call that the disagreement thesis, which says that persistent disagreement implies, there's our if-then Savannah, right? So it's going after that, right? The disagreement thesis says that if there's disagreement about X, then there are no objective truths about X, right? And we've seen this kind of move before, so hopefully it's familiar to you. But of course, proponents of the disagreement thesis claim that D is true, right? However, there's disagreement among philosophers over thesis D, the disagreement thesis. In fact, I disagree with it. So if the disagreement thesis is true, and the disagreement thesis says disagreement implies non-objectivity, then that would mean that that premise is not true. So we got a contradiction because they want to say it's true, but there's disagreement over it. So we end up with a contradiction. Disagreement intractable disagreement implies non-objectivity, and persistent intractable disagreement does not imply non-objectivity, right? So if we're looking at this objection and our argument, this one's going to go after the conditional premise, right? You see the difference there, Savannah?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was what you were asking about, right? So just to review a little bit, we did this back with the Johnson article on truthiness. In the lecture associated with that, we've got some basic steps to walk through to identify self-contradiction or self-contradictory or self-defeating claims, right? So recall the 4 steps and then think about our argument. Again, the major premise is the one we're worried about here. Does the argument propose a standard or criterion? Yeah, it says that if there's disagreement, there can't be objective truths. So it's got some standard for objectivity in there, right? So it proposes a standard. Does the standard apply to itself? The content of that statement does apply to any claim, so it's going to include itself. It's like me making a claim about all bald guys. That's making a claim that includes myself, right? There's the self-referential part of it. And then, third question, does the disagreement thesis meet its own standard? Well, we just walked through how it fails to meet that standard. It violates the law of non-contradiction. In its own case, it says that it's true, but in everybody else's case, it says that it implies non-objectivity, so it can't be both. So we got a contradictory premise there. Again, walking through the steps of showing how an argument implies a self-contradiction is almost always going to involve making an implicit contradiction explicit by showing however many steps it takes how something explicitly stated in that argument implies the exact opposite of itself or another claim in the same argument. Bless you. So you can go back over and look at that if you want, right? And then here's Schaefer-Landau. So again, from the article that you read for today, has an objection to that kind of persistent disagreement argument. Again, right out of the reading for today. So he says, there's persistent disagreement among informed, good-willed, open-minded physicists and mathematicians. We and they assume their efforts are nevertheless aimed at discovering objective truths. We do not believe that taste is the arbiter of truth in math or physics. Indeed, we can make this quite general point about investigations of all sorts. When historians debate the causes of the Civil War, they're not merely entering their personal views with nothing other than parochial preference to back them up. Historians are trying to discover what really caused the Civil War, right? Was it just the railroad? Was it slavery? Was it all those other factors, right, together? They continue to disagree about this, but they continue to disagree about this, but this is not evidence that their discipline is subjective, the way that all of ethics would be subjective according to that argument. That the truths they arrive at are mere expressions of taste, for example. It isn't the case that historical or physical or mathematical judgments are true just because someone believes them. Right? Y'all know who Peter Pan is, right? Probably done this before, right? Peter Pan believes that Never Never Land exists if what? You just believe it really hard, right? So I'm pretty sure I can believe that I have a full head of hair all day. It ain't going to make it true. Similarly, I can believe all day, and with as much might as I can muster, that squares are the same things as circles. It ain't going to make it true, right? So mere belief insufficient for... So that basic point was made again in the truthiness article, right? So what this shows is that a discipline may deal with objective truths even if its open-minded, informed practitioners deeply disagree with one another. Suppose for the sake of argument that criticism is true. Which premise would it go after? Does it deny, and this gets back to your question, Savannah, does it deny that there's disagreement?
No.
No, it says that disagreement doesn't imply what?
True.
Non-objectivity. So which premise is it?
One.
It's premise 1. Everybody see the difference between how that objection attacks a conditional premise and the one we looked at on the worksheet just attacks an assertion, right? Premising? Yeah.
Explain that one more time.
Yeah. So He said, in this passage, what's the main point, right? He says it a few times, but he says, what this shows is that a discipline may deal with objective truths even if its open-minded, informed practitioners deeply disagree with one another, right? So another way of saying that is just because there's disagreement doesn't imply that there's no objective truth, right? And so premise one is disagreement, truth, connection. So it's going after that whole conditional statement written a different way, but the ideas are still being challenged there. He's not saying that there's just people don't really disagree. He's saying they do, but that it doesn't imply this other thing, right? Does that help? Other questions? So here's how not to refute moral skepticism. Article from Johnson. There are no moral truths. That's a meta-ethical claim, right? Moral here means prescriptive or normative. Again, keep that distinction between meta-ethical claims and prescriptive claims and the relationship between them straight. So this claim is not obviously self-defeating, like there are no universal truths, which is just about any truth whatsoever, right? So this claim is a meta-ethical claim, but it's a meta-ethical claim that denies that any of these claims are true, right? Moral skeptics, moral anti-realists, they're not claiming that meta-ethical claims can't be objectively true or false. They're claiming that there are no objectively true prescriptive or normative claims. And this claim itself is not prescriptive or normative. Everybody understand why? It's not issuing a value judgment itself. It's a statement about the status of value judgments, that there are no moral truths, right? Everybody see that? So it's not a contradiction because in the way that there are no universal truths is a self-contradiction, because this statement would apply to itself, right? Because it's a truth claim of any sort. But this claim is a meta-ethical claim about prescriptive claims. It denies there are any objective prescriptive claims, but it itself is not a prescriptive claim, right? So again, you got to make sure and keep meta-ethical statements, distinguished, but related to prescriptive statements. They're about the status of prescriptive statements. And then we've got a few counterintuitive implications to worry about with. So again, we did this before with moral relativism, and I talk about it in the How to Evaluate Moral Theories lecture, if you want to go back and look at it. It's again, just like in moral relativism when we saw that, well, that would imply there's no moral progress. It would imply moral equivalence and moral arbitrariness between cultures. And so that's all highly counterintuitive, doesn't mean that's something wrong with moral relativism. We get the same thing here. So if moral relativism is true, and I think we did a worksheet on this one as well, then moral discourse is the same as aesthetic discourse. In other words, discourse about right and wrong, good and bad conduct would be equivalent to discourse about what's pretty and isn't pretty. Most of us, I think we mentioned this last time, most of us don't treat debates over whether 6ix9ine is a better rapper than Kendrick Lamar. He's not. The same as we treat arguments over abortion, right, or lying, right? It would also imply moral equivalence, that contrary moral equivalents are equally true. So if subjectivism is true, then beating the crap out of little old ladies is morally equivalent to helping little old ladies across the street, right? That's a hard one to swallow, right? So again, counterintuitive implications. And then moral arbitrariness, again, would mean that your moral compass is really, it's not controlled by anything other than just personal whim. So again, when we talked about moral relativism in the cultural sense, it was like, it would just be an arbitrary function of whatever culture you happen to be socialized in. Right? So we get some counterintuitive implications there. And then let's go over one more argument for anti-realism here. Let's go over an evolutionary debunking argument. Y'all know Rick and Morty very well? So if you don't know, it's a pretty funny show, but it's got a lot of philosophy in it, both in terms of the nature of reality, personal identity, as well as morality. So it's why I had y'all read it at the beginning of the semester, because a lot of the episodes are structured like Platonic dialogues, like we talked about. And in this Vindicators 3 episode, Morty, speaking to, I forget his name, Vance Maximus, I think, Morty tells Vance Maximus that Rick says that good and bad are artificial constructs. So that would mean Rick is a what? Anti-realist or an anti-realist? Anti-realist, right? It's a construct. It's made up, right? And then in another episode, Rick has a fairly pessimistic view of what love is. So we're going to draw an analogy here that moral feelings and moral sentiments would be like love here, right? So he says, what people call love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed. It hits hard, then it slowly fades, leaving you stranded in a failing marriage. I did it. Your parents are going to do it. Break the cycle. Rise above. Focus on science, Morty, right? So kind of two elements here. Rick thinks that basically he's saying, like, we have feelings of love. It's a trick of evolution to make us breed, right? To spread our genes, right? And morality is an artificial construct, right? Here's what's called an evolutionary debunking argument. And I just pulled it out of a book called Very Bad Wizards, where it's this interviews, and I'm pretty sure I posted the interview for you on Moodle. If not, I'll double check and make sure it's up there. But here's the passage. Here is a guy named Michael Ruse, R-U-S-E. And he's the anti-realist here. He says, Tim Simmons is the other guy, TS here. He says, he's the interviewer, so he says, an illusion. So then you're saying that the only true connection is that Darwinian evolution, can account for why we falsely believe that ethics is real. He says, no, I distinguish normative ethics from meta-ethics. In normative ethics, I think evolution can go a long way to explain our moral feelings of obligation. Be just, be fair, treat others like yourself. We humans are social animals and we need these sentiments to get on. Before I mentioned, the study that was about morality as cooperation and finding those 6 elements that seem to cut across all cultures in morality, or to be a part of all cultures, at least ones that survive. So he says, we humans are social animals. We need these sentiments to get on, like love, right? I like John Rawls' thinking on this. Rawls is a Kantian philosopher. We're about to cover that here, coming up. On about page 500 of A Theory of Justice, he's making a joke there because it's a big book. And some of it's really boring. It's just important, right? So I like Rawls' thinking on this. On about page 500 of The Theory of Justice, Rawls says that he thinks the social contract was put in place by evolution rather than by a group of old men years ago. Then in meta-ethics, I think we can see that morality is an adaptation merely, and hence it has no justification. Having said this, I agree with Mackey, who is our own example of a error theorist, who influenced me a lot. We feel the need to objectify ethics. If we did not think that our ethics was objective, it would collapse under cheating. So in other words, he's saying that evolution has outfitted us with these impressions or these intuitions that our ethical language tracks objectivity, but like Mackey, he's saying all of those are false. That's the error in error theory, that presumed appeal to objectivity in our moral language, right? So if you just think about how you use moral language yourself, it seems to have that realist assumption in it. When you say, don't kill little babies, right, you're saying it's true that you shouldn't kill little babies, right? That's the assumption he's challenging there. So a little bit more on evolutionary debunking here. This comes from an article by Joshua Green. He says, as noted above, recent evidence from neuroscience and neighboring disciplines indicates that moral judgment is often intuitive and emotional matter. Although many moral judgments are difficult, much moral judgment is accomplished in an intuitive, effortlessly way. An interesting feature of many intuitive, effortless cognition processes is that they are accompanied by a perceptual phenomenology. What he means by that you can kind of think about it in terms of ordinary language, how we talk. Don't you just see that that's wrong? That's what he means by so if you see me drowning little kittens in paint for fun, you're not going to think, oh, I need to explain to my friend why that's wrong. You're going to think, don't you just see that that's wrong? Right? So that's what he means. And actually what neuroscience has discovered is that there are two basic forms of moral judgment. One is like he's describing, is quick, intuitive, and has that gut thinking feel to it. And there are other slower, more deliberate versions of it. So picking up on this, he says, all of this makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. We have evolved mechanisms for making quick, emotion-based social judgments, for seeing rightness and wrongness, because of our intensely social lives favor such capacities. You can think about it from an evolutionary perspective. If we didn't have lights, you'd be a lot scareder of the dark at the edge of the village. And if it doesn't look like you, it's going to get killed, or you're worried that it's going to kill you, right? But, it takes a while for evolution to catch up to our sedentary lifestyles, but we still have that heritage, right? So that's what he's getting at here. But there's little selective pressure on our ancestors to know about the movement of distant stars. There's more selective pressure on them to figure out friends and foes, or cooperators and non-cooperators, right? So he says, this is just a hypothesis. I do not wish to pretend that the case is closed, or more generally, that science has all the moral answers. Nor do I believe that normative ethics is on its way to becoming a branch of the natural sciences, with the is of science and the ought of morality gradually melding together. Instead, I think that we can respect the distinction between how things are and how things ought to be, while acknowledging that the preceding discussion illustrates, that scientific facts have the potential to influence our moral thinking in a deep way. Let me mention the is-ought problem here, since he's mentioned it. This is a problem in metaethics. It's often related to the open question, or if you're a philosophy major or minor, the naturalistic fallacy. David Hume's version of it is just called the is-ought problem, and here's how it goes. Science, empirical verification, tells us how the world is. What does morality tell us? How we ought to behave, right? So one of those is evaluative, and one of those is just factual. And the is-ought problem says that you can't derive a normative or prescriptive conclusion from a purely factual claim. You have to insert desire and feeling and this other stuff in it that's relative to me. So let me give you an example. I often do this sometimes in class, and people will object, and they'll say, well, if the building is on fire, you ought to run out, and that's true. But that presupposes that I want to live. If I don't have the will to live, maybe I stick it out in the burning building. Right? So the point is that a purely factual claim doesn't imply an evaluative claim. It's the factual claim plus a bunch of stuff on the inside of your head about how you feel and the sentiments that you have that gives rise to the conclusion, right? So that looks like that's another way of trying to show that morality is not rooted in factual claims or in objective facts. It's rooted in us. That's, again, another kind of anti-realist argument there. Everybody get that? It's the is-ought problem, right? So picking up back with Green here, he says, we have here the beginnings of a debunking explanation of moral realism. We believe in moral realism because moral experience has a perceptual phenomenology, and moral experience has a perceptual phenomenology because natural selection has outfitted us with mechanisms for making intuitive, emotion-based judgments. Much as it has outfitted us with mechanisms for making intuitive, emotion-based judgments about who among us is the most suitable mates. It ain't romantic love that drew me to my wife. It's probably pheromones and the way she smells that I'm not even aware of, right? That's probably what's driving more of it than anything else. There's a reason why we call it falling in love. It's because you didn't sit back and decide to do it. You just felt it. Right? So that he's making the same kind of claim, not just about romantic love, but about moral sentiments as well here. So he says, therefore, we can understand our inclination towards moral realism not as an insight into the nature of moral truth, but as a byproduct of the efficient cognitive processes we use to make moral decisions. According to this view, moral realism is akin to naive realism about sexiness. like making the understandable mistake of thinking that Tom Cruise is objectively sexier than his baboon counterparts. Well, Tom Cruise isn't objectively sexier than his baboon counterparts to the baboons, right? So it's something we're projecting onto the world, not something we're discovering. So go back to our basic distinction. Realism, we're discovering moral truths either through empirical inquiry or rational insight versus we're making it up somehow, right? So a basic evolutionary debunking argument can be put this way. If moral realism is true, then correct moral principles or rules are true or exist independently of human belief. That's what moral realism typically means, right? Is that they are independent of my feelings and practices. The same way that it's true that there's snow on Mount Everest is independent of my feelings about it, right? Or a mathematical point. So that's premise one. But moral principles and rules likely developed over centuries of human evolution so that human beings could survive in groups. So they are not true or do not exist independently of human belief and practice. Therefore, moral realism is not true. So there's a basic, again, another little, we did another Modus Tollens version of an evolutionary debunking argument there. And here's a basic one. I'll show you a more sophisticated example of one here. They get pretty hairy, but there's another one. This one's by Susan Street, who's a proponent of this, contemporary proponent of this view. And her argument goes like this. Again, just a little bit more detailed than the simple version. Human systems of moral judgment are thoroughly saturated with evolutionary influence as a result of natural selection, which has shaped the moral intuitions that guide moral judgment. So it seems like it'd be pretty easy, and it kind of is easy to tell an evolutionary story about why a lot of us find do unto others intuitively appealing, right? Because you wouldn't want other people in your community doing those things to you. It would make your life harder, so you don't do it to them. We all cooperate and survive better that way. Right? So natural selection, selected for those moral evaluative judgments that promote biological survival or fitness, not that track moral truth. If moral intuitions shaped by evolution correspond to objective moral truths, it would be a matter of sheer coincidence. Wouldn't it be lucky that my intuitive gut thinking just happens to match up with what's objectively true? So we're not justified in thinking that such a coincidence has occurred, so we cannot justifiably believe that our moral beliefs accurately represent or track objective, mind-independent moral truths. Right? So again, just a little slightly different version of it, more complicated version of it, but then let's take a look at two objections here. We got two basic ones. First, that some moral intuitions seem to resist evolutionary debunking, and second, that it causes runaway debunking. That it's going to debunk not only the ones that you happen to disagree with, but ones that you would like to retain. So let's see what somebody says about those. Here's Peter Singer. Here's part of it is the too swift, the too fast. Here he says, you can distinguish between intuitions that have evolved in the manner just like suggested above and ones that haven't. So he says the ones that you can tell a really good story about evolving are like ones that, like where you have more attachment to your intimates and your family, right, than strangers, right? But then he appeals to Sedgwick's axiom of rational benevolence, that you're supposed to be impartial. Well, the fact that y'all are probably like I was. When my parents raised me, they weren't moral theorists, but they taught me from a very early age that there's a difference between how you feel about something and what's fair or unfair, right? Fair or unfair has to do with some kind of impartial principle. But if evolutionary debunking works, then we shouldn't have any kind of impartiality at all. It would all be partial for our in-group or our intimates, right? So he says, the former are not likely to be truth tracking. But consider the intuition supporting Sedgwick's axiom of rational benevolence that requires us to be impartial across different people. Not to be just concerned with my offspring's well-being, but that leads me to be concerned with non-family member or non-intimate well-being as well. Y'all aren't my family, right? Y'all are members of my community. Why should I care about you from an evolutionary perspective, right? I need to care about enough of you, only enough for me to get by, but that leaves a lot of people hanging in the wind, right? So he says, it's very hard to see how that intuition could have conferred by any evolutionary advantage. That intuition is therefore likely to be a rational insight into moral truth. So one more time, everybody see what he's saying here? That not everything is debunkable according to evolution. Not all moral sentiments are debunkable according to moral evolution. Which premise in this argument would you say he most directly is challenging? Does he have some different conception of moral realism in there, in that passage? No, so we can rule out which premise? One. The one with the moral realism claim in it. 2 says, but moral principles and rules likely developed over centuries of human evolution so that human beings could survive in groups, so they are not true and do not exist independently of human belief. And what did he just say? Some of them probably have not been. So if there's some that have not been, then that means all of them have been is false. So he's going after premise 2 there. Everybody see that? And then, just to wrap up, let's look at ethical objectivism, an argument for that real quickly here. So if ethical objectivism is true, we've already seen ethical naturalism is one way to try to do that. Here's the ethical non-naturalist way to do that. It's like another form of moral rationalism. The idea is that it's based on is a truth of reason. The law of non-contradiction, which we've already covered, is an example of a truth of reason, but it doesn't have any moral content to it. It's not prescriptive. It's about logical truths. So think of the law of non-contradiction. If we deny the law of non-contradiction, which says that a statement and its opposite can't both be true at the same time in the same respect, we would obviously land in self-evident absurdity, because that would mean that statements like God exists and God does not exist are both true at the same time in the same respect. Both of those can't be, right? It's objective in that it applies universally, and it's not a matter of empirical verification, but rational insight. So if we could find a normative claim that had those 3 aspects plus D, it's prescriptive, then we would have not just a truth of reason, but an ethically significant truth of reason, and that would give ethical objectivism some ground, some plausibility. So here are 2 possibilities for that. Let's take the first one. No one is responsible, let's say morally responsible, for things totally beyond their control. Would it make sense, India, I'm going to use you as an example because you're one of the only people in the room that I know the name of other than Savannah so far, so you're getting picked on until I learn more names. Okay. This is the downside of being in 2 of my classes at once. Right? No one is morally responsible for things totally beyond their control. Would it make sense for me to praise or blame you for how tall you are?
No.
No, why not?
Because that's determined by my genetics and I can't control my
You can't control that unless you can go back in time and reverse genetically engineer yourself, which you can't do, right? So it would be like, so we can't, so then it would be morally wrong for me then to praise or blame you for how tall you are, right? So go back here. So if we denied it, we would be holding people absurdly responsible for things like the weather, right? Controlling the weather, or how tall you are, or your eye color, or something like that. It applies universally. This is a universal negative there. It's objectively true that it doesn't seem to be a matter of empirical verification. And the idea there is that, for you to be responsible, the concept of responsibility has built into it the idea that you could control it somehow. So again, earlier today in my class with India, we talked about intellectual vices and why you can be praised or blamed for those, but not cognitive biases, right? Same kind of deal there. And it's prescriptive. It guides conduct in terms of praising and blame. So it looks like we got a candidate that meets all 4 of those. We get an ethically significant truth of reason. If there's claims like that are true, then ethical objectivism is going to have some plausibility to it. So we'll wrap up.